Thank you very much for that very nice introduction. And there's been a lot of invitations for people to come and visit their countries, but I'm going to Kyrgyzstan next year, I promise, and I took my free map with me, so I'm gonna hang on to this. Today I'm going to be talking about how the media can both help a nation brand and also do great damage to it. I want to start by asking the question, what connects the billionaire fantasy author J.K. Rowling, American horror film director Eli Roth, and the British comedian Sacha Baron Cohen? Well, the answer is they have each, at one time or another, been accused of besmirching some country's nation brand. In the case of Rowling, it was Albania. Like a long list of British writers before her, she used the mountainous Adriatic country, known to its own people as the Land of Eagles, as a foreboding redoubt for villainy in her fabulously successful Harry Potter series. This ruffled the feathers of more than a few officials, tourism officials in Tirana, who were hoping more for visits from voluptuous sunbathers than from the nefarious Lord Voldemort. Eli Roth was drawn into a mediated battle with no less a personage than the Slovakian ambassador to the U.S., Bratislav Kačer, over Roth's depiction of the country, the Central European country of Slovakia, in his 2000 film Hostel. That movie depicts Slovakia as home to a torture den where wealthy businessmen get their jollies by mutilating American backpackers who are unlucky enough to check into that particular hostel. And who could forget the bumbling and benighted Borat? Sacha Baron Cohen spent nearly a decade masquerading as a reporter from Kazakhstan, exhibiting grotesque behaviors that he affirmed were the national traits of that most glorious Central Asian nation. I highlight these three controversies as a way to introduce the notion that media matters when it comes to nation branding strategies, which by definition must be conceived and implemented in an environment that we all now recognize as truly a global village. Today I'm going to speak to you about an increasingly important role that mass media, and particularly globally distributed digital media, play in shaping, maintaining, and even disrupting national brands. My focus will be on three areas: effectively employing media as a tool for nation branding; secondly, mitigating the deleterious effects of unwanted anti-branding from abroad, particularly in the form of hostile news coverage, aggressive parody or satire, and uninformed or fantastical depictions of a given country and its people in films, television, and other popular media. And lastly, I want to synthesize positive and negative media coverage, and so that a country can inoculate its national image against the greatest threat of all, and that is a lack of brand recognition. My talk will build both on my professional background, which includes 5 years as a management consultant to the telecommunications industry, working both in brand and also marketing and government relations, and my academic research, particularly my investigation of Kazakhstan's decade-long battle with Sacha Baron Cohen over the Borat parody. When you leave here today, it is my hope that I will have given you some food for thought on managing media in the global context. If you take away one message from my presentation, I hope that it is this: there's no such thing as bad publicity, only bad publicity management. Even the worst media depiction can be turned into a boon for a nimble and imaginative nation brander, if they possess the right tools for anticipating, responding to, and ultimately, and this is key, co-opting pernicious depictions of their country and its peoples. Just a few words on nation image in the global era. It's long been recognized that the national image of a state is important both for defining, and we've talked about this in some of the, I'm lucky enough to have been here for all of the presentations. It's important, nation image is important for defining the self, right? You may use the term national identity. Selbstbild is the German word for this, how a nation sees themselves. But there's also the Fremdbild. This is also how foreigners see them. And often the two of these things work together in tandem. And over time, actually, I think this term was used before, help develop the psyche of a particular country. Over time, this perception by others, in the case of states, can become an important factor in how they behave and how they view themselves. In many ways, being a country is like being in high school. There are the cool kids, the jocks, the bullies, the nerds, the wallflowers, and the anti-social burnouts. I will resist the urge to affix particular states to these meta-categories, but I'll let you all draw your own conclusions. And in this system of states, each peer group has its own dynamic and a highly sophisticated system for categorizing and interacting with others, including the all-too-familiar tools of aggression, ridicule, exclusion, and, sadly, disregard. However, it's not all bad. There's always an upside to this schema. that upward mobility is always a possibility. And this is where I would argue that nation branding actually comes into play. Returning our focus from the high school playground to the international community, Joseph Nye suggests that a positive national image provides the ability to entice and attract other countries. Such attention often leads to imitation in the case of smaller countries, or acquiescence in terms of more powerful nations. Consequently, national image and a country's general reputation are major components in alliance building and figure prominently in international conflict as well, some of the things we've talked about here today and previously. While older countries enjoy well-established national images at home and abroad, the past century has seen the emergence of roughly 100 new nations that face a double challenge. They are charged first with crystallizing a coherent national image in the domestic realm, that is, determining, defining, and or delimitating a national identity, which theoretically applies to and is accepted by 100% of its citizenry. And secondarily, states carry the burden of transmitting a country image to the world community. Such an image must be clear and intelligible. It must be distinguishable and mutually exclusive from all other nations. And it must be seen as positive. Assuming that these factors are in harmony, a state may be said to have achieved some sort of brand equity, or reached a point where the country provides a unique cachet to those communities with which it interacts, that is, alliance and trade partners, investors, international organizations, and non-governmental organizations, and, of course, tourists, something that a lot of the presentations here have been addressed to. Now to the concept of nation branding. We've heard a good deal about it already here at the conference, but just in the interest of sort of academic research, I just want to give you a little bit about how I deal with nation branding. While nations have always had to manage how they are perceived abroad, that is actually what we use diplomats for, is it not? Clearly, such concerns are acutely heightened in the current global age. The spread of digital information and communication technologies, the purported victory of the neoliberal system, and the deepening of complex economic independence have made governments ever more attentive to their national image. This leads us to the topic of this very conference for which we are gathered here today. Borrowing from the field of business management, international relations scholars have begun to explore the management of national image through strategic policy initiatives, targeted public diplomacy, and discrete programs intended to alter the global perception on both the elite and mass levels. And this is a way that nation branding, I would argue, does differ from diplomatic efforts in the past. Of course, this new field of inquiry that we're talking about is nation branding, a phenomenon which is distinct from national image due to the active rather than passive nature of policy elites and the shaping, changing, and maintaining of their country's image. In short, nation branding is the practice of brand management applied to a country's national image. In nearly every corner of the globe, polities are now actively engaged in building, maintaining, and protecting their national brands. As some historians have pointed out, there's nothing new about this except the explicit reference to the word branding. Certainly, as Wally Owens has pointed out, Napoleonic France, Bismarck's Germany, and Ataturk's Turkey all basically branded themselves or rebranded themselves for the age in which they lived. While certain countries are reticent to embrace the full-blown corporatist approach to managing their national image, other nations, particularly smaller and newer countries, of which we've had a few presentations over the course of the week, have wholeheartedly endorsed this particular notion, utilizing strategies that have long been employed by cities such as New York, Sydney, Shanghai. Spain and Ireland are often pointed to as some of the early successful examples of this, and even bigger countries and very well-known countries like the UK have gotten into it with their cool Britannia, which was done under the new Labour government. Well, the influential journal Foreign Affairs, Peter Van Ham, who's already been quoted once today, argues that the importance of creating a brand state through effective image production and maintenance of a dependable reputation is now paramount in the postmodern political system. Simon Anholt, who actually coined the term nation branding in 1996, suggests that brands are gradually becoming the dominant channel of communication for national identity. And Melissa Aronczyk argues that brand has become the dominant genre by which the nation is now expressed. State branding is particularly important for reinforcing positive images and blunting or negating unflattering ones. Effective branding depends on the content, resonance, and reception of a country's image abroad. Like any corporate brand, a country's image is variegated and may carry large amounts of information of both factual and effective information. And there's been a lot of back and forth here about whether or not you can actually create a brand based totally on things that are made up. I don't think you can, but I think you can certainly exaggerate them. So there has to be, I think if we can find a common medium here, there has to be a mixture of the two. No one wants to express their brand purely in factual terms, and also you don't want to express a brand that has no facts behind it. National brands must also reflect reality and avoid contradictions in messaging, as I was just saying. And failure to do so leaves a state open to charges of cynicism or hypocrisy and may result in severe damage to its reputation. And lastly, and this is the key point of my talk, states must increasingly deal with alternative narrators to their national identities and state brands, a troubling reality that has disproportionately affected the world's newest countries. Now, the problem of new states in world history. In my writings, I basically talk about 3 waves of decolonization that have occurred in the 20th century. The first wave took place in and during the Great War, and certainly thereafter, beginning with Finland and basically ending with Iraq. So from 1917 into the 1920s, you had a host of new states, particularly in Europe, being born by the breakup of the Hohenzollern Empire, the Romanov Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. After World War II, we see that shift really moving to what at that point in time came to be known as the Third World, as the maritime empires of Western Europe slowly began giving up their territories in Africa and Asia, birthing countries such as Tunisia, Ghana, and Indonesia. The second wave basically began in 1946 with the Philippines and ended with Mozambique's emergence from Portuguese rule in 1975. Now, the third wave, and the one that is less thought of in these terms, but there was a third wave of decolonization that really began in 1991. And I'm happy to be following Kyrgyzstan, which is one of these countries. You had the breakup of the socialist federal states of Czechoslovakia, of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and also of Yugoslavia. And this has created a third wave of decolonization, which can be argued is still ongoing. Because as recently as 2008, you had Kosovo's unilateral declaration of its independence and a partial recognition by the international community. And you also had Russia's recognition of South Ossetia and also Abkhazia, which is yet to be recognized by that many countries, though one of the countries that recognize them has been represented here at this conference. Now, while most states in the first wave, that period after World War I, enjoy worldwide brand recognition, the same cannot often be said for a large number, and perhaps even a majority, of those from the second and third waves. And of course, there are certain exceptions to that, as Russia would be, and I'll be talking about Russia. These new or comparatively new countries must grapple with the difficulties posed by the triple threat of global economic independence, cultural hybridization, and the ebbing of state sovereignty, wrought by the increasing power of non-state actors, including multinational corporations, intergovernmental organizations, transnational judicial systems, global civil networks, and the list goes on and on. In this vociferous geopolitical environment, new nations have had to accept that marketing, advertising, and branding have become integral parts of statecraft. Now, I'll take a little sip. Now, turning to the main focus of my talk. I want to discuss why media matters for every nation branding campaign, but before I do that, I want to provide you my own analysis of the most important aspects of nation branding. In my research, I basically follow a model established by Simon Anholt, but I tinker with it a little bit. So there are 10 relevant factors. Law-abiding elites, stability and good governance being the first. Attitudes and the orientation of the people, something that I think the African countries who are presented here have really done a good job in expressing to us. Suitability for foreign and direct investment, personal safety and security of property, reliable and desirable export products, a unique cultural heritage, an attractive geography. Again, we've seen lots of images of this thus far over the conference. National treasures and tourism sites, environmental and natural resource protection, and globalization readiness and receptiveness. So these are basically 10 factors that I look at when I'm working on nation branding and looking at it from a theoretical perspective. It's important to also remember that nation branding includes not only the activity of a given state's government actors, but also its celebrities, its companies, and particularly products. I mean, we all know that certain products are associated with certain countries. Nokia evidently is associated with Japan, though it should be appropriately associated with Finland. But of course, Coca-Cola for the U.S., Sony for Japan, and others. Likewise, sports teams such as England's Manchester United, international celebrities such as India's Shilpa Shetty, and media products like Qatar's Al Jazeera network all have their role to play in nation branding. Now, the tools of the trade. Every country should have a well-developed plan for employing the media, and especially, as I argue, new media as a tool for nation branding. I'm not going to lie to you, and this has been said before, nation branding via the media is going to cost you money. Every nation brand campaign needs a sizable budget to undertake even the most modest media-centric branding campaign. Beyond this, one needs ready access to and long-term commitment from the country's political elites, particularly at the highest level. And the smaller the country is, the more that you need this, I would argue. In addition to these factors, you must have a team of smart, innovative, and nimble entrepreneurs, and I hope there are a few of them out there in the audience, or at least looking to go into this career field, to support the branding effort. Assuming these attributes are in place, let us now turn to the tools of the trade. If your budget is nearly limitless, you can afford the best. Let's take a moment to consider how Russia has used the mass media to rebrand itself in the past decade. Simon Anholt once quipped, "Almost everybody has an opinion about Russia, and it's likely to be a poor one." Russia has a great deal to disprove before it can even start acquiring positive brand attributes. While this may be true, Russia has massive resources at its disposal. And the most obvious manifestation of this is Russia's employment of its global satellite television network, Russia Today, which broadcasts in English, Arabic, and now Spanish. RT is a highly effective tool for Moscow as it seeks to promote a positive view of Russia on the world stage. While it is not officially under direct government control, the broadcaster is closely affiliated with the Kremlin and generally adheres to a pro-government stance on most issues. While media analysts in the West are quick to label this as a modern-day version of Pravda, I believe this critique to be a hollow one. Coverage of international events are basically analogous to the same coverage, the pro-Russian coverage of RT event. Russia's pro-Russian bias is relatively analogous to CNN's pro-American bias, or even BBC, though it would claim otherwise, to its pro-British bias in terms of international coverage. RT is a sleek, highly professional, cosmopolitan affair, replete with dynamic graphics and reporters drawn from around the globe. Unlike CNN and BBC, both of which carry enormous amounts of political baggage in the developing world as a result of geopolitical associations of the networks with their respective governments, RT is comparatively free of such historical blemishes on its character, outside, that is, of the former Soviet republics. Alongside Al Jazeera English, RT has quickly emerged as an international media platform with a strong focus on the global south, proudly reporting stories from a perspective which is critical of Western hegemony and suspicious of American motives in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. This type of framing is a powerful tool for Russia as the country seeks to rehabilitate its brand in parts of the world where the Soviet Union was once respected and emulated. Furthermore, by challenging lingering Cold War stereotypes of the country, which can be found in nearly every CNN or BBC broadcast about Russia, RT is able to promote Russia as a genuinely new country in terms of its foreign policy goals, economic relationships, and geopolitical profile. When it comes to the coverage of Russia itself, it's even more effective. And I won't read from this part, I'll just tell you about it because I'm quite familiar with it. RT has done a major service to the country, particularly in terms of the coverage of terrorism events that take place in Russia. Up until 2005, you had from 1999 to 2005, you had an enormous amount of terrorist attacks on Russian territory, both in the North Caucasus and in Moscow. Russia was probably about the third most dangerous country to live in terms of terrorist attacks, and that includes countries that were currently in a state of war at that time. Up until the end of 2005, really, the Western media, the only sources that were being provided to them after a terrorist attack were Western journalists that were resident there. And they were basically sort of recreating these Cold War stereotypes, bringing with them their own biases. But beginning with December of 2005, you had RT. Now, RT has people on the ground, fluent English speakers, can actually control the information that is flowing to the West. And I've been working on, one of the research projects I've been working on, is looking at how this is really impacting how the West is now conceiving of these terrorist attacks in Russia. Because RT now provides all of the video, and increasingly they're actually providing the perspective. The analysts that are talking about these terrorist attacks are now analysts that have been chosen by RT. And the most interesting situation was there was a terrorist attack right below the RT headquarters, and the journalists themselves then became actually spectators and sort of journalists that were also speaking as witnesses to this event, giving almost complete control of the media environment now to RT. That one's been fairly effective. I would say that RT sort of went overboard with the Russian-Georgia war and were called out for it. So RT is not always perfect when it comes to this. So this has been very, very effective. And also, by the way, I can stream directly RT for free on this. They're reaching out on an individual level, not just trying to reach people through satellite network directly. They're also going through the internet and making all of that content available for free, something that even Al Jazeera doesn't do. They charge you a small fee. Now, if you don't have $100 million in startup capital to fund your own global multilingual satellite network, perhaps you could set your sights a bit lower. Right? A tried and true method, though one which is arguably a bit overdone, is the targeted special advertising supplement. This glossy international relations magazine, Foreign Policy, is the favored venue for these branding efforts, alongside the New York Times and some of the other Financial Times and some of the other newspapers. This allows a country, the one in Foreign Policy, an 8-page spread with vital statistics about your country, color graphics, advertising space for important local industries, interviews with key policymakers and business executives. These tend to be particularly popular with sub-Saharan African countries, which again has been very important for this particular conference. And the reason for this is because Foreign Policy reaches 200,000 foreign policy elites, amongst 18,000 of whom actually live in the Washington, D.C. area. Foreign Policy markets its readership as a who's who of influentials. However, the obvious problem here is if all of these countries are basically producing the same product over time, and we've seen ads from Angola, Cape Verde, Sao Tome and Principe, Mozambique, Ghana, have all run ads recently. Sometimes these things begin to blend together. So this may not be the best route moving forward if you're actually looking to distinguish your country. So I want to talk about actually using new media as a way to reach mass populations. And I'm going to use a case in point of Kazakhstan, and I'll talk more about this later. But one case in point, this Kazakhstan case, was when you have the Sacha Baron Cohen controversy beginning to grow larger and larger and larger in the European mind. And in 2005, basically Kazakhstan decided to go on the offensive, right? And they posted, Roman Vasilenko, who was the spokesman for the U.S. Embassy, began posting videos about the country on YouTube. And these short videos were very, very effective. He was basically trying to go viral with this approach. And it was done in conjunction with ads in the New York Times, ads in Foreign Policy, and also other sorts of public diplomacy. But he crafted these short videos, a 1-minute video and then a 9-minute video, that focused on Kazakhstan's nation brand, I would say, more than just a tourism. It wasn't just focused on tourism. So he wanted to sort of ring all 10 of those bells. And so going through that, we look at the law-abiding elites, stability, and good governance. These videos stress the country, the remarkable leadership of Nursultan Nazarbayev, and Kazakhstan as a respected and reliable partner in the international community. The second factor I talked about were attitudes and orientations of the people. Kazakhstan, as we learned from these videos, was recognized by Pope John Paul for its ethnic and religious tolerance in a region of the world where this is not necessarily the norm. Likewise, the videos offer proof of a well-educated entrepreneurial population full of optimism for the future. Thirdly, nation branding must address suitability for foreign direct investment. These videos position Kazakhstan as the economic engine of Eurasia, discussing how the country transitioned from one of the worst-off fragments of the Soviet Empire into an economically strong and dynamically developing democratic country. It is also, as the videos argue, one of the fastest-growing economies in the world. Now, while the video didn't directly address the notion of personal safety and security, the overall imagery, tone, and content of the film suggests that the country was law-abiding, safe, and prosperous. So these are some of the things that the videos focused on. And the most interesting aspect was people would comment on the videos, and Vasilenko would actually respond to them. And the key was he didn't take himself too seriously, right? And this was the key for dealing with Borat, as I'll talk about more in a minute. But there was one question about, I want to buy some sulfur from Kazakhstan, which had been one of the things that he said that Sacha Baron Cohen said it was the world's leading exporter. And so he responds to this and says, there were so many Americans that wanted to purchase this that we're now out, but we're going to try and locate some more. And there were some more serious issues as well about Kazakhstan's record on freedom of the press and not being too lighthearted there, because that would actually be ineffective in terms of nation branding. He said, I want to position it this way and that way, and if there's more information I can provide you, I'm happy to do that. So he's actually interacting on, this is a diplomat actually interacting with anonymous people on YouTube making these comments. So it's really, I would say, kind of a radical approach, but one that ultimately became effective, as I'll talk about in a minute. Right. So given the world recognition of the so-called YouTube effect wrought by this spread of viral videos, it's not surprising that governments are getting in on the game of producing internet films for global distribution. Looking to the future, however, nation branders should think more aggressively. Social networking sites like Facebook and Twitter can now be harnessed to create fans, friends, and followers of countries in the same way that corporations, music bands, and politicians have done in recent years. One thing that we're focusing on in the United States is Obama's Facebook page. He has an enormous amount of Facebook followers, and this is seen as sort of an early edge that can be leveraged in the coming presidential election, which we are slowly gearing up for in the United States. The previously mentioned iPad, which I'm using here, and similar tablet-based computing devices could potentially become powerful new platforms for branding, as these devices allow software developers to cheaply produce and distribute highly interactive applications that end users can download and access on a weekly or even on a daily basis. So imagine an app for Costa Rica or Malaysia that includes regularly updated information on the business climate, emerging tourism destinations, and the country's political leadership. If an app like Plants vs. Zombies and a piano for your iPad can just overnight catch fire, why not something for a country that actually has something to say and someone is actually interested in? So as new media technologies develop, a host of novel possibilities for nation branding will present themselves. But one needs to be ready and one step ahead of the curve. This demands putting together a team of branders which is intergenerational, and I see a lot of young faces out there today, and again, I hope that you get involved in this, and which is drawn not only from the political and tourism sectors, but also from the fields of academia, business, technology, and the arts. Now, moving on to the second piece of my paper, I want to talk about the unwanted exposure, media depictions, and anti-branding. Writing about the changing nature of diplomacy in the networked world, media scholar Elizabeth Hanson states, "The stage of world politics is so crowded that it sometimes seems difficult to see who the main characters are. Occasionally minor characters lurking in the background, or evenly previously invisible ones, leap to the center of the stage. Now, this reference to such interlopers might bring to mind Osama bin Laden or Julian Assange, but for nation branders, the stalking menace is more often likely to be a Hollywood scriptwriter or an Ivy League educated satirist. In an idealized statist world, a country's nation brand would primarily be determined by the work of the government in the realms of politics, economics, science, sport, and culture. In the postmodern, interconnected world of satellite news networks, SMS, video phones, Kindles, iPads, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, all countries now face the unwelcome narrators of national identity in the form of mass-mediated depictions of their countries and peoples. Given the realities of the current era of deterritorialized media products and transnational information flows, cultural producers are instrumental, one might argue even key, in constructing geographic knowledge about the outside world. As Philip Kotler and David Gertner point out, the entertainment industry and the media play a particularly important role in shaping people's perception of place, especially those viewed negatively. In the realm of academia, a new field of study has developed in recent decades under the moniker of popular geopolitics. Well, this comparatively new subdiscipline within the larger field of geopolitics, it's been rapidly growing. At its root, popular geopolitics is focused on the everyday representation of spaces and places, and particularly how citizens conceive and speak about geographies beyond their own shores. These scholars, myself included, read popular cultural forms as texts, attempting to interrogate the political, social, and cultural content of these representations of geopolitical space, as well as the various peoples who inhabit them. Through analysis of the mass mediation of geography in that spaces, places, and peoples of Earth, popular geopoliticians seek to explain the complex relationship by what has been termed state elite geopolitics and popular conceptions of how the world actually works. Geographers and academics are increasingly looking at how comic books, film, television, etc., how ideas that are put forth about places and spaces are now leaking out and actually entering into the conduct of international relations in the world. Just moving quickly ahead because I don't want to take too much of your time. With the advent of the 20th century, motion pictures have played a particularly important role. According to one scholar, motion pictures, as an immensely popular form of entertainment, are highly effective in grabbing the attention of mass audiences. The power of film lies not only in its apparent ubiquity, but also in the way it helps create, often dramatically, understandings of particular events, national identities, and relationships to others. In my own teaching of undergraduates, I find that every time I bring up a country, usually the first thing that's related back to me by my students about that country is its depiction in a popular film, whether we're talking about the film The Kingdom for Saudi Arabia, or Tears of the Sun for Nigeria, or City of God for Brazil. So looking at these, we have to talk about how such mass-mediated structures are able to actually impact nation brands and what nation branders really should do about them. And I look in my own research, and my current research agenda is looking at a comparative study of the 15 post-Soviet republics and what they have in common. And one of the things they have in common is they've been described by one author as being a very large Trashkanistan. Basically, everything that one can imagine negatively about a particular country can be found in post-Soviet space. And we've all seen James Bond films over the 1990s that really played on these fears, the loose nuke fear, the crazy anarchist who's now angry that the Soviet Union is gone and is going to recreate the power of the Soviet Union. And so these are things that have played really deeply into our psyche during the 1990s. Certainly since 2001, the shift has been, to some extent, away from Russia and post-Soviet space and more towards the Middle East. But as I said before, my focus really there is on the former Soviet Union. And so in that vein, I've been looking particularly at satirical works. Some of you may be familiar with The Onion, which is one of our great satirical newspapers and now has a television network, etc., in the United States. And just to give you an example, a very quick example of some of the ways that countries in the former Soviet Union have been labeled, I'm going to read just a few of these descriptors for you. Belarus, according to The Onion, will be inhabitable by the year 2307. Ukraine is marketed as the bride basket of Europe. Moldova is the continent's basement. Armenia is a country where the population digs mass graves for old time's sake. And Turkmenistan is home to the world's greatest dictator. Now, each of these nuggets evinces a bit of that second world stigma that dogs the former Soviet republics, which have, through a mixture of triumphalist, schadenfreude, and chance, become a running punchline for many Westerners, or have been subsumed within this unreal but instantly recognizable post-Soviet dystopia. Now, Ukraine, which is increasingly branded as an independent state, still grapples with the problems of its little Russia image. The problem is the distinction without difference from Russia is, however, not confined to the Ukraine. Moldova and Belarus similarly fit into this category and have confronted difficult realities vis-a-vis nation branding which have been multiplied by domestic political problems. Elsewhere, ancient peoples like the Georgians and the Armenians, two of the earliest Christian nations, which was reinforced by our presentation here by Ms. von Habsburg, had some basic advantages in developing their country's nation brands, particularly via a very influential Armenian diaspora in the case of Armenia, but they've made little headway really in distinguishing themselves from other post-Soviet states. Perhaps most difficult of all are the Central Asian countries, all of which end in the Persian affix stan, which stands for land. Everyone, though the reality is not the case, everyone tends to associate these countries with war, tribal violence, Islamist terror, endemic poverty, and dramatic levels of gender equality. And the reality is that this is not the case. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan in particular, really defy these prejudices that have been turned over and recycled again and again in the media. Now, in contrast, the Baltic republics of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have made formidable progress in developing brand recognition in the West, despite their post-Soviet heritage. Estonia markets itself as e-Estonia, basically the home of e-governance. Latvia is the land that sings. Lithuania is Lithuania the brave. These have had some brand resonance, particularly among Europeans. And this is in large part because they've had this sort of help of NATO membership, help through the European Union. And they are increasingly branded as Eastern European countries or Nordic European countries rather than being lumped together as part of post-Soviet Eurasia. But even these countries have problems. All three of them, and particularly in terms of nomenclature, all three of them ending in the IA, like Slovakia, Slovenia, etc., has been a real problem in terms of trying to distinguish themselves. Estonia actually thought about adopting a different name for its country, perhaps going for the German name, which would be Estland, or the Estonian name itself, which is Eesti. But these were ultimately rejected despite the recommendations of some nation branders who were working, consultants who were working with the country. Lithuania is actually still toying around with making some changes to its name, either adopting its own nomenclature, which is Lietuva, or perhaps going for a different pronunciation, which would be Lithuania, to give some sort of resonance associating the country with its use of Latin during the Middle Ages for its parliament. So even in the best examples across former Soviet Union, there are still real issues that are affecting these countries as they try and establish brand identity. Now I want to turn to my case study, which is Kazakhstan, that I'll talk about, and then I'll go a little bit more into Central Asia, and then I'll try and wrap it up to leave some time for questions. So, Kazakhstan. Lacking a historically well-defined country image beyond its borders, the Kazakhstani government has worked hard to build a unique, recognizable, and credible national brand. Its elites and its masses see Kazakhstan as categorically different from its troubled fellow stands to the south, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan, and predictably are uncomfortable with any associations with Afghanistan, which possesses an entirely different historical and socioeconomic character. According to Roman Vasylenko, who I mentioned before, Kazakhstan's former press secretary in the U.S., it's frustrating when we are lumped together with a country where girls were prevented from going to school for a decade and where the burqa is worn. This confusion with countries like Pakistan is also troubling as well. Kazakhstan's quiddity is based on being a resource-rich, multicultural, and stable outpost in an otherwise troubled region of the globe. Uncomfortable with its Central Asian stereotype, which combines Soviet and Islamic legacies of autocracy and authoritarianism, the Kazakhstani government has sought numerous venues to present a positive image to the world, including hosting of the 2011 Asian Winter Games, in cooperation with NATO as well. So it was not surprising when Sacha Baron Cohen, the British creator of the fictitious Kazakhstani reporter, Borat Sagdiyev, touched a raw nerve with his increasingly high-profile parodies of Kazakhstan as a medieval backwater with brutish and racist misogynists as its citizenry. After several years of modest success on British and American television with the Ali G show, the character rose to more global stardom with an eponymous feature-length film in 2006. The Borat motion picture unexpectedly provided the country with a precipitous increase in its global profile, though one which came at a hefty price. The premiere of the film signaled the high watermark in the postmodern conflict between a British comedian and the leadership of the world's 9th largest country by geography. The feud dates all the way back to 2000, when a Kazakhstani diplomat, Kaliev, condemned Borat's portrayal of his country, saying, "We can take a joke like anybody else, but this has gone too far. It's a form of racism, and we want Borat banned," and actually trying to reach out to the British government and have them shut down this comedy show. This shows a sort of learning curve from 2000 all the way through 2006, when shortly after the film premiered, Nazarbayev, the president of Kazakhstan, in a press conference with Tony Blair, actually made a call out to the audience saying, "Is Borat here? If he is, I would like to speak to him because I want to thank him for basically all of the free press that he generated for Kazakhstan." So you really see here a shift from this sort of post-totalitarian approach of trying to ban information that one does not like, to beginning to engage with the postmodern media system. And I attribute a lot of this actually to Roman Vasilenko himself, who was quite young. He was, I would say, in his mid-30s when he was dealing with these controversies. And rather than trying to shut it down, he actually took every opportunity that he could to engage with the press. So he got to the point where he was almost happy when Borat or Sacha Baron Cohen would say something negative about Kazakhstan, because he knew the phone was going to be ringing basically later that day. The New Yorker magazine, New York Times, CNN, MSNBC, anyone you can imagine in the United States was calling him on a regular basis, and he took every one of those opportunities to turn that little bit of falsehood, those mean-spirited jokes, and to turn those into an opportunity to speak about what Kazakhstan is really all about, what its people are like, its level of multiculturalism like Bishkek. It also has 100 nationalities in the country. They live together in peace. The country is increasingly being recognized as a sponsor for interfaith dialogue between the Muslim world, the Christian world, the Jewish world, the Buddhist world, etc. So each one of those opportunities, he took it and he maximized it. And I think that's the key where young people really can make a difference when they're helping out with nation branding campaigns. They can bring these ideas to their elders and say, let's look at it this way. Let's turn the cube a little bit and see if we can actually benefit from this thing which we see as highly negative to begin with. I'm going to dispense with talking about some of the other cases. I was going to talk about Triplakistan, which Mike Myers invented, and some of these other false countries, these sort of made-up countries that sort of they have a knock-on effect to the nation brands of real countries. And this is particularly a problem for Eastern Europe. Some of you may remember the film The Terminal, the Steven Spielberg film The Terminal, which invented a country, but it had certain attributes which were immediately associated with post-Soviet space. All right, so I'm just going to conclude. In an intensely connected and cosmopolitan world marked by what can be called an organic solidarity in international relations, states must differentiate themselves and provide value through their specificity. This truism has a direct impact on national identity production among younger states. In the crowded arena that currently constitutes the field of international relations, it's starkly evident that images are more important than ever. While comedians, filmmakers, and satirists may not carry diplomatic credentials, it's increasingly clear that they and other alternative narrators have a role to play in determining nation brands. When we think of media, we should always keep in mind Simon Anholt's maxim: the alternative to managing national image is not managing it, but allowing someone else to manage it for you. In recent years, satellite television, the internet, and the proliferation of mobile devices and manifold applications which connect all of these things together has revolutionized the consumption of entertainment, news, and information. Predictably, there's been a concurrent broadening of the geographic scope of Western media products, far beyond what has been traditionally described as the West. Corporate consolidation of media companies has reduced the global diversity of all media, and consequently, more people and places have access to the same media sources, and thus concern themselves with the same issues. Political changes since 1989 have also contributed to this new milieu, creating an environment more open to the global spread of creolized cultural identities. The dismantling of the Iron Curtain, the end of communism in China, though they continue to say that it's still there, has really introduced us to this global village that Marshall McLuhan promised us back in the 1960s. As another one of Sacha Baron Cohen's alter egos, Ali G once stated, "International relations is not just about having a Bangladeshi cousin." His fatuous reflection underscores the complex nature of foreign policy and diplomacy that in the current era of globalization involves an intricate, sometimes almost invisible web of state and non-state actors. International relations are now, by definition, both public and private. Consequently, the importance placed on branch management of a country's image reflects a clear understanding of how the contemporary world actually works. When you leave here today, if there's one thing that you take away, I hope it is this: media matters. While we cannot all be lucky enough to have the resources to fund a global satellite network to promote our country's brand, as in the case of the Russian Federation, we do have tools at our disposal. advertising to cheap and ubiquitous content and distribution, and social networking platforms such as Facebook and Twitter is just one of those examples. However, we must realize that these new media are a double-edged sword. Just as they allow nation branders to reach out to the masses, they also allow interlopers like Sacha Baron Cohen, The Onion, and others to perpetuate old stereotypes and create new ones out of whole cloth, thus undercutting the hard work of people such as yourselves. It is incumbent on all nation branders and those affiliated with these important efforts to respond appropriately to the challenges of the new globalized era of information. Threatening and ignoring these alternative actors is not an option. Playfully co-opting them and their cultural products is always a better solution, and one which can provide long-term synergistic effects that will continue to produce political and economic dividends long after the original joke, insult, or fabrication has been forgotten. So I want to thank you, and I want to thank Mark Donfried and other members of the ICD for inviting me here today, and I'm happy to take your comments and questions. Thank you.
I would like to thank you for a real, I know you weren't able to get through the totality of your presentation. It's really in-depth. We would like to take questions, but we've got another creative presentation that we would have to split, and we've got an ambassador coming at 4:30. We have one we're trying to fit in, so I know you're on the panel.
We're on the panel.
And
tonight,
Dr. Ariel is on the panel, so we're virtually into her time. So what we'll do is pretty much during the panel discussion, if you can save your questions and you can craft it into the panel discussion. Let's give Dr. Saunders another round of applause.
Thank you.